Welcome to today's explainer. We are jumping right into a really fascinating and, honestly, pretty intense topic. Today we're unpacking scholar and educator Don Rivera Diaz's critical analysis of monolingual gatekeeping, systemic bias, and the myth of meritocracy in American public schools. Now, this is a heavily debated issue, so we're not here to take sides. Instead, we are going to objectively map out Diaz's arguments, his data, and the historical context he provides, giving you a crystal clear look at the source material. So here is our roadmap for the explainer. We'll start with schooling versus true education, move on to structural inequity by the numbers, then look at the monolingual administrator problem, followed by citizenship and belonging, and finally, wrap up with the burden on educators. Let's dive in. Diaz doesn't ease us into this. He opens with a pretty harsh reality. He cites this direct, jarring administrative order. Get rid of them. And this was directed at students who simply didn't speak English well enough. According to Diaz, when an administrator orders a teacher to just remove multilingual children from a classroom, we have to recognize that we aren't looking at a pedagogical decision anymore. The text actively characterizes this as a linguistic and, frankly, racial purge, just dressed up to look like a conversation about academic standards. Which brings us to the core concept of the entire text: monolingual gatekeeping. Diaz points out something we often forget. Marginalized multilingual kids are doing incredibly heavy cognitive lifting. They are learning a brand new language while simultaneously trying to learn standard academic subjects like math and science. School should obviously be a supportive environment for that. But instead, this gatekeeping ensures these kids are systematically treated as institutional problems to be eliminated. It essentially uses English proficiency as a hard barrier, blocking their access to opportunity and a sense of belonging. That takes us to Section 1, Schooling versus True Education. To really understand how this gatekeeping operates, Diaz leans on scholar Carter G. Woodson's framework to contrast standard schooling with true education. It's an important distinction. The text defines standard schooling as this imposed, historically narrow system that was originally built for a very specific demographic: whites, English-speaking, and middle class. And Diaz argues that the foundational design of that system doesn't just magically vanish when the student demographic changes. True education, on the other hand, is completely different. It's actively affirming. It meets multilingual students exactly where they are. True education expands a student's full human capacity, and crucially, it never asks a child to check their cultural or linguistic identity at the classroom door, just to earn the right to learn. Moving on to Section 2, Structural Inequity by the Numbers. Now, you might be wondering, is this just anecdotal? Well, Diaz brings the receipts. Citing data from the National Center for Education Statistics, the Education Trust, and the National Council of La Raza, the research outlines measurable, cascading barriers for English language learners and Latino students. The data is clear. They graduate at significantly lower rates. But here's the catch. Diaz emphasizes this isn't because they are less capable. It's because the system chronically underserves them. They are routinely tracked into schools with way fewer certified bilingual teachers, they face constant administrative turnover, and they are consistently locked out of rigorous, culturally affirming coursework. It's a structural failure, not a student failure. And let's look at how this systemic bias actually plays out day to day. Based on peer-reviewed data from the American Educational Research Journal, there are stark disparities. Black and Latino students face much harsher discipline, get referred to special education at way higher rates, and are placed in advanced coursework at significantly lower rates. But here is the absolute most critical takeaway Diaz presents. These disparities persist even when you control for actual academic performance. Let that sink in. That data point reveals that these outcomes are reflecting the biases of adult decision-makers, completely independent of how the students are actually behaving or performing. Which naturally leads us to Section 3, the monolingual administrator problem. Tracing these exact data-driven inequities right up the chain of command, Diaz makes a very bold, direct statement here. He says, monolingualism is not neutral. The research asks us to consider the heavy historical weight of language in the U.S. Throughout history, English has been actively weaponized against indigenous languages, the languages of enslaved Africans, and the languages of immigrant groups. Because of that history, holding absolute administrative power over a multilingual community of color while only speaking English is inherently not a neutral position. The text makes sure to note that this doesn't automatically mean an individual is racist, but it absolutely creates the structural environment where bias can thrive completely unchecked. Diaz maps out this predictable failure loop to show us exactly how this happens in real time. It's like a domino effect. First, an administrator is placed in charge without any formal training in second language acquisition, or really any lived experience with that specific community. Second, Because they lack that competency, they misdiagnose totally normal linguistic challenges as fundamental cognitive or behavioral deficits. And finally, that leads to a massive failure in leadership. They entirely fail to see the bright, highly articulate kid sitting right in front of them, just because that kid is hidden beneath a temporary English language barrier. To put this into perspective, let's look at some educational leadership research on how representation actively shapes administrative assumptions. If a Latina administrator is observing a quiet multilingual student, her shared cultural background might allow her to immediately recognize potential, resilience, and complex thought happening in that kid. On the flip side, a monolingual white administrator who has no community accountability or shared representation might look at the exact same student and just see an institutional liability. Diaz argues this isn't about some mystical connection. It's strictly about how a leader's lived experience dictates the baseline assumptions they bring to the job. Let's transition to Section 4, Citizenship and Belonging. To highlight the total failure of monocultural schooling, Diaz brings up Puerto Rico as a prime example of historical distortion. Just look at the timeline. Puerto Rico was forcibly incorporated into the U.S. way back in 1898, and its people have held U.S. citizenship since 1917. Diaz stresses a crucial fact here. Puerto Ricans do not immigrate to the United States. They migrate within their own country. So when someone tells a Puerto Rican student to go back to your country, it's not just incredibly offensive, it is literally historically illiterate. And Diaz suggests that this kind of widespread historical ignorance is a direct indictment of the American educational system itself. But the source material takes this a step further. Diaz characterizes this go-back rhetoric as a highly deliberate, xenophobic silencing tactic. Think about who it's used against. It's deployed against Mexican Americans whose families lived on the land before the border even existed. It targets Asian Americans who have deep generational roots in the U.S. It's thrown at Black Americans whose ancestors were forced to build the country. Diaz argues fiercely that this specific phrase is engineered to communicate that certain people just do not fully belong, regardless of their legal status or how deep their roots go. It's a tactic meant to unperson marginalized groups, and the text plainly labels this practice as what it is: racism. Finally, we reach Section 5, the burden on educators. Diaz uses a really powerful term here: structural violence. This is the agonizing burden placed on caring educators who are essentially forced to choose between their ethical morals and their paychecks. When ordered by monolingual bosses to just abandon struggling students, teachers are put in an impossible spot. But the text doesn't just point out the problem. It describes specific, culturally sustaining classroom strategies to fight it. Diaz highlights practical steps like actively integrating a student's home language into daily assignments, bringing in culturally relevant text, and encouraging peer-to-peer multilingual collaboration. And for the teachers out there facing intense systemic pushback for trying to use these exact inclusive methods, Diaz offers some vital advice. This pushback is not your personal failing. You are navigating structural pressures that are designed to favor easy compliance over actual empathy. Then, shifting his focus directly to the marginalized youth who are caught in the middle of all this, Diaz offers this incredibly validating message. He tells them outright, "You are not the problem. You never were." He assures multilingual students that their presence in the classroom isn't an imposition. Their native languages are not cognitive deficits, they are massive assets. The actual problem, according to Diaz's research, is a system that was designed without them in mind, run by people who were never required to earn their community's trust. Diaz concludes his critique by demanding we call this what it is. The push to exclude or get rid of low English proficiency students is discrimination. And he leaves us with a really provocative final question to chew on, challenging everyone, educators, administrators, and the public. If we know this system is built on structural inequity, what power do we actually have to refuse it? And more importantly, how are we going to use that power to demand a system of true education that finally affirms the humanity of every single student? It's a huge question, and it perfectly captures the urgency of Diaz's analysis. Thanks for joining us for this explainer.